welcome everyone here. These are the Thursday afternoon speaker series of the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry here at McGill. Privilege for us to have Professor Peter Sterling with us. He's a professor of neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. He has had a long and distinguished career in looking at the brain and neurocircuitry in relationship to a variety of adaptive systems, fine scale structure of neural circuits, but also a great interest in stress response and allostasis, as we'll be hearing about, and so on. He's also been, I think, importantly and of great interest to us, very active in the community and in political life as an advocate, as a person working for equity and addressing some of the serious challenges in our societies. And I think that's, even though these are maybe separate domains of intellectual activity and work in some ways, I think there's been an interesting crosstalk, and particularly in some essays and reflections that he's published more recently. So, and as I was mentioning just before he came on, that the part of the stimulus to inviting him right now was reflecting on this book, which Anna and I have been reading and discussing a little bit, also because we're involved in a project called the Canadian Framework for Brain Health, which is trying to articulate ways of thinking about the brain and neuroscience research and its implications, the implications of current research for public policy and health policy, trying to develop ways of thinking about it that are critical and better informed than what tends to happen, which is just the latest exciting piece of research gets touted and it's presented as though it's going to solve all kinds of things, and it doesn't necessarily engage with the complexities and the situated nature of the dilemmas that we're dealing with in health and other walks of life. So with that little bit of framing, I would like very much to just turn it over to you, Peter, to take the floor and let us know how you'd like to structure this in terms of your own presentation, and look forward to the discussion with you.
Well, thanks very much for this kind introduction. I'm delighted to be there. I'm very eager to get people to read the book. I tried to write it with some science, but not too hard. And I've made the offer everywhere I do talk, is that if a group of people get together and they want to discuss the book, like a chapter a week or something, I'm doing this with some students in Amsterdam. I'd be glad to visit. Either at the end or intermediate times. I mean, this is a good use of my time, is talking to people who are interested in the book. I am bringing up, I just completed a translation into Spanish yesterday. It's at the publisher where I live. And so I'm excited about that. And feel free to share my email. I mean, I have a lot of links to essays on my email. If anybody wants to communicate with me, I'm eager to do that. So with that, why don't I go to the PowerPoint and share my screen and get on with it, okay? There we go. Okay, so the title is the same as my book that we mentioned. And I start by noting that my lab focused on this fine scale neurocircuitry, leading ultimately to this book with Simon Laughlin in Cambridge. The idea of this book was that the brain is smarter than a supercomputer, but uses 100,000-fold less energy in space. And this is fostered by the body, of course, must also be efficient. It's 80% of our total energy. And to achieve this, the brain predicts needs and regulates physiology and behavior to meet them. Joseph Weyer and I called this allostasis, meaning stability through change, to contrast it to homeostasis, which means holding everything constant. So we recently updated the story in Trends in Neurosciences. And so this led me to this new book, What is Health?, which asks, what does our species, our human species, need for a healthy life? And can we achieve this with drugs? And why, for example, did Homo sapiens' brain invest in art? It doesn't provide any calories. It doesn't move us along in any obviously practical way. So why did our brain evolution invest so much in art and music and dance and so on? And then the question is, I'm qualified to talk about circuits, but maybe what about culture and these sorts of things? And my answer is that there was an interplay between my laboratory work and my social activism. And so the book and this talk reflect how I've lived. This was my first scientific report at Cornell University, Ithaca, New York in 1961. Upon submitting it, I left Ithaca for Mississippi to join the Freedom Rides. And that was 61 years ago this month. And so many of you may be forgiven if you don't remember exactly what that was. But the idea was that, at that time in the US, there was racial segregation in interstate travel, in fact, in all travel in the South. And the idea was to travel whites and blacks together. We would be arrested, and we would fill the jails, ultimately in Jackson, Mississippi. And that would force the Kennedy administration, John Kennedy and his brother Robert, to integrate interstate travel. And so at this short film clip, I'm on a train, I'm 20 years old, I'm sitting, this is my seatmate, and I was interviewed. I discovered this film a few years ago. And this is, this is me.
How about you? Can you give me any of your feelings on why you want to take part in this?
Well, I want to help establish the right of all Americans to eat together and to travel together.
Why do you think it's your responsibility?
I think it's every American's responsibility. I only think that some are more conscious of their responsibilities than others.
Okay, so about 30 minutes later, we got off the train, we were arrested, and we were processed. This is my mugshot, and it's now on my email and my Twitter account. So my concern for social justice persisted, and now by now it's the mid-1960s. I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, at Western Reserve University as a graduate student studying motor pathways from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord and brainstem. And here's the corticospinal pathway to the spinal cord. And I'd slip away from my microscope to canvas door to door in Central, which was the poorest Black ghetto in Cleveland. And the people who answered my knock were often partially paralyzed, limping, sagging face, slurred speech. And back in the lab, I learned that the immediate cause was the destruction of pathways by stroke from chronic hypertension. I recalled that my grandfather had lived in Central when it was a Jewish ghetto. He was a house painter in a Jewish union, and he too suffered hypertension and early stroke. So I began to think that maybe hypertension is related to social tension. So fast forward to my own laboratory a little bit later at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. I was still slipping away, but now to the library to seek evidence for the causes of hypertension. Hypertension, by the way, is high, just simply fancy name for high blood pressure, chronic high blood pressure. I was also devouring ethnographic studies to learn how other people lived. And soon I was slipping away to visit indigenous communities in Central America. And now I live half of each year in the mountains of Western Panama, sugarcane. So here's what I learned. First, that blood pressures of foragers, horticulturalists, are low and they're steady with age. And this is, for example, this Nobe indigenous family waving to us lives in Panama on the Caribbean slope, 2 days walk from the nearest market. This is also true for similar groups in Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa. But in the US, blood pressures rise as children enter school. So this graph shows on the horizontal axis age and systolic blood pressure on the vertical axis. And what you see is that the immediately as children enter school around age 6, leave home, their blood pressures start to rise. And by graduation, 25% are in the hypertensive range. So this reflects sustained physiological arousal. The rise is steepest for African Americans who were the most stressed, And that's because in the US, Black lives still don't matter. Now, this is a recording, a 24-hour recording in one individual who has a little tube in his arm, a cannula in an artery. And this is noon, this is midnight. And this is arterial pressure, systolic and diastolic. And what this shows is that blood pressure is not something you have. Doctors say you have 120/80 blood pressure, but it's not the case. It's really fluctuating all over the place in response to each change in mental state. And so, for example, this is 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the individual is dozing at a lecture. His pressures come way down. He's stuck with a pin. He awakens, the brain predicts danger, raises the pressure. He looks around, discovers it's a prank. His pressure falls back down, he goes back to sleep. And then there are these various unidentified peaks and valleys. And at midnight here, this is an identified peak preceding sex. He becomes sexually aroused, and his brain predicts the need to raise the pressure to support his activity. Then at night, after sex, he sleeps, and his pressure comes way down. And the next day, in the morning up till noon, it rises again to cope with his day. So this is allostasis. The brain recognizes the context, predicts the need, and adjusts the pressure to match. It provides just enough, just in time. This is a slogan from Toyota's assembly line, but biology figured it out several billion years earlier. So I want you to note the wide dynamic range from very low to very high, and that it's exquisitely responsive. And this is health. I consider a definition of health is responsiveness to what's going on outside and inside our head and body. So arteries adapt to predicted mean pressure. This is the record I just showed you, where the average pressure is around 100 millimeters of mercury. And this is what the arteries would look like. They have sort of modest walls with muscles lining them, but with a healthy open lumen for blood to flow. This is a record of someone who has chronic hypertension with a pressure, mean pressure of around 160. And this is what the arteries look like. The muscles in the arteries, when they're subjected to chronically high pressure, hypertrophy, just like your skeletal muscles do to lifting weights. And eventually they begin to occlude the lumen, and you get arterial sclerosis. So all the mechanisms for blood pressure are controlled by the brain. This is what I learned in the library. The brain, first of all, controls the kidney. It has nerve fibers to go on endocrine cells in the kidney that control the amount of salt water that the kidney pumps into the blood to control the plasma volume. It controls the heart rate and strength of contraction. And the two of these combine to control the cardiac output. If you put the cardiac output through the arterial vessels who have a resistance to them, you end up with a particular pressure. And so the brain is in charge of all this. Moreover, the brain controls your appetite for salt. And doctors will tell you, don't eat too much salt. We shouldn't eat. But in fact, the brain decides how much salt we need and drives us to seek it. So J.P. Henry, who studied this for many years, concluded that psychosocial arousal induces salt appetite, making a society's salt consumption a measure of its social stress. Now, drugs can block each of these mechanisms, but the brain compensates. So for example, we give a doctor will give you a diuretic to cause your kidney to shed salt water into the urine and reduce the plasma volume. But the brain says, I know where the pressure I want it to be, and it increases the heart rate. So then we can give a drug to block that. A beta blocker is commonly used. And the brain will say, fine, but I'm going to increase the resistance in the vessels. And we can block that too. And so what happens is that it's possible to control the pressure, but now the system can't respond to new predictions. And I'm old. I walk with some old guys for exercise and companionship. And many of them are taking particularly beta blockers. And it's fine until we come to a slope, a gentle rise. And then it's impossible for their heart to increase the cardiac output. So we have to slow down and rest. The beta blocker, and all of these drugs affect multiple points in the body. This is just true for every single drug. They're not side effects, they are effects. And the beta blocker, for example, raises blood glucose, and so it exacerbates any existing or type 2 diabetes or anything close to it. So you can then treat that, of course, with more drugs. And the result is basically is an ill patient who is stabilized precariously by polypharmacy. And so now that's all physiology I want to say right now. So I want to switch gears and consider some problems with US health. And I know I'm speaking to Canada, but whatever we suffer, you're likely to be next. And connect this to some aspects of our neural design and discuss what we need to do. Now, one of the important statistics is that deaths of despair, by which we define as overdose from drugs, poisoning from alcohol, and suicide, are rising, have risen sharply in the US over quite a few years, but very, very sharply for the last 20 years. And this is a curve representing US whites, but there are equivalent statistics for other ethnic groups and so on. These are whites now of middle age, born in 1970, and there you can see that their death rates from these deaths of despair are rising. Now, the rate in the US is fourfold greater than this, steeper than this curve for males with no education beyond high school. And in the US, that's 60% of white males. The US down here, you can see that Canada and the UK and Australia are showing a less severe trend, but it's in the same direction. Now, another way to look at it is by cohort. And so the cohorts, these older cohorts, I'm the cohort of 1940, and we're doing okay toward the end of our life, not that much despair. By 1950, it's getting worse. And so this is the cohort of 1970 that I just showed you. It crosses this line of 100 deaths per 100,000 at about age 45. 10 years later, the 1980 cohort crosses the same line at about age 35. And if we plotted the subsequent cohorts here, the curve gets steeper and steeper. So there's a real crisis now in the US. At the same time, obesity is rising from what I call foods of despair. That is sweet and despair over the same period, corresponding to this period. And I call these murders of despair, these mass shootings. And these are murders that gun control, this is the despair that gun control is not going to cure. So the question is, what causes our collective despair? And first, consider our huge brain. The human brain is 3.5 times that size of a chimpanzee, which is our nearest surviving relative. And it grows slowly in childhood, using 60% of our total energy. And that's really why our body grows so slowly until adolescence, because most of the energy and resources are going to grow the brain. Now, this graph, I think, I'm beginning to think, is one of the most important graphs that explains human evolution. Age is on the bottom, and this is net production of calories on the vertical axis. And what it shows is that the growth of a large brain requires care by 2 adult generations, because at birth we're not producing any, we're just sucking up calories. All through our childhood, we're sucking up more and more calories, and only by age 20 do we about cross this line and take care of ourselves. So any of you who have Teenagers don't expect very much. We didn't evolve that way. And then look what happens. At 20, the hunter-gatherers go off into the environment with their elders, and they learn how to find food, either by hunting it or gathering it, or growing small crops. And I think the key thing here is, look, this continues. Their skill, their productivity continues up to about age 45, and then it stays high, and only way after age 60 does it begin to cross the line of dependency again. So productivity that peaks after 45 means that for 200,000 years, gathering and hunting were challenging careers that demanded prolonged study and practice. And that lent meaning to our lives. So the second point about the brain is that everyone is different. The brain specializes to conserve energy and space. And this is something I came to appreciate working on the book with Simon Laughlin. So this is the view of the left hemisphere. Every square centimeter is occupied by some specific circuit. We have about 200 specialized circuits, but once we have that, basically, we can't improve our own individual intelligence because the territory is occupied and the skull is full. What we could do is to give each brain a unique set of these circuits and a different circuits for each brain. And so that confers each individual in the community with a set of innate abilities. We practice our innate abilities because that is what is most rewarding. And so this is what produces a community of experts, a hunter, a healer, a gatherer, an artist, and so on, a navigator. And so communal intelligence outcompetes a design where everyone is the same. This makes us awesome as a species, but there are costs, and you know them well. That one is mental distress from our individual strangeness, and also interpersonal conflict. So, but the problem is that to benefit from communal intelligence, we must cohere. And so this is achieved by various sacred practices, what words alone cannot express. So the brain, this is why the brain invested, I think, in costly circuits that go well beyond collecting our food. And so example is we made cave art. This is the earliest known example of cave art from 44,000 years ago. And it looks pretty much to me like the minute we arrived as a species, we were painting on caves and devoting resources to do that, because the artists who painted this or artists were highly skilled, and they must have been supported by other members of the community to do this work. We also began to make music. This is a 40,000-year-old flute, and so these activities elicit intense emotions of awe, cooperation. So after 200,000 years, communal intelligence produced, guess what? A steam engine. And that immediately drove an immense increase in industrial production. This is CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. This is a year, and you see that the introduction of steam engine just immediately triggered this soaring rise of CO2, and we have not managed to turn this curve around yet, and we're in trouble. So industry also shrank the opportunities for challenging activities, and this was recognized almost immediately by Adam Smith, the father of economics. He said, the man whose life is spent performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding or exercise his invention. He naturally loses the habit of such exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Well, I don't think we've become stupid. Actually, the problem is that we're still smart, but we've narrowed the possibilities to exercise our innate gifts. So we evolved to explore the planet, and we did. We're coming out of Africa. We got to every continent in no time. And now multitudes among us have to punch a ticket or scan a barcode. And this Jobs learned in minutes or days present insufficient challenge to animals like us who have this gigantic brain. So I think it's the mismatch between our abilities and our opportunities to exercise them that causes despair. So what links despair to compulsive consumption? We inherited a circuit that drives seeking. The circuit rewards an unpredicted find with the pulse of dopamine. And here's an example. This is a dopamine signal in a neuron. It's firing away action potentials. And when the reward is unpredicted, you get this spike, extra spikes, and extra pulse of dopamine. And when we get a pulse of dopamine, our experience is a pulse of satisfaction that allows us a pause in our seeking. But as the pulse dissipates, we must resume seeking to serve the next need. This is the design of the circuit. Foragers find food unpredictably, a root, a rabbit, a berry, and so on. For each one of these finds, they get a pulse of dopamine. They find comfort also unpredictably, a dry cave, a warm fire, something like that. And they get frequent pulses of dopamine because most of their life is unpredictable. We find food and comfort predictably without effort or surprise. And of course, it's very convenient, but these predicted rewards don't provide much dopamine. And so here's the same neuron when the reward is predicted. And you can see that there's just very little response, no dopamine. So lacking frequent pulses, we need these pulses to feel comfortable. And lacking them, we grow restless and we search for surprise. And so when food is predicted, when you know where you can get it in the supermarket or at a restaurant, the main surprise is more and richer. And the problem is, so you get these surges of sugar and fat, which cause surges of dopamine. And I'm not making this up. This is well documented. But then if the surprise is more, the next surprise must be even more. And we go from a Mac to a Big Mac to a Whopper. And the brain adapts to each of these surges by reducing its sensitivity because that's the design of the brain. Any increase in something causes a counter reduction of sensitivity. It's the same story for drugs. Alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamines, and opioids all evoke these surges of dopamine to which we soon adapt. Drug addiction, I want to say here very firmly, I think it's a drug addiction is not a substance use disorder. It is not a disorder in any way. The initial consumption of a drug or rich food is a natural effort to escape or despair, to find some dopamine. The next part is the escalating use, which is a natural adaptation of neural circuits. This is what they do, okay? So just as our retina, which I studied for many years, adapts to more light by reducing its sensitivity. If you want to see the stars, you have to go out and dark adapt. When we get more light, the retina turns its sensitivity down, and that's what is an issue with all of these other processes. So I'd like to summarize. Health, I think, is responsiveness. It's adaptation to continual change. It involves predicting future needs, and that minimizes effort, and that's why it's efficient. We reduce the errors. Allostasis includes all processes that that support predictive change. And the first cell that evolved billions of years ago had a molecular clock to predict what time to make its DNA, because if you make it during the sunlight, the ultraviolet destroys the DNA. So the clock predicted when night would come and time to begin to reproduce. The first brain was a worm, a marine worm, and it predicted all its own needs, and it learned where to find the resources. It remembered where to go, and that's the brain that that was the ancestor of our brain, and it had this dopamine circuit in it right then. So these molecular and neural circuits were optimized by 500 million years ago, and now we're tweaking them with drugs to fix the problems that arose over the last 200 years. But drugs that block these ancient signaling pathways reduce responsiveness. So we treat despair, addiction, obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease at the molecular level, not to speak of all sorts of mental disturbances with a panoply of drugs. But polypharmacy is not a plausible route to health, and it's very, very expensive. So I think that our brain evolved for individualized lives of physical, cognitive, emotional, and spiritual responsiveness, learning across the lifespan, and it is our responsibility to live such lives and to help others live them. Now, one more comment is that what I think it requires is everybody has to be included. Everybody has to feel that their lives actually matter. Reducing inequality reduces the stress and despair, and thus improves health. Health requires that we practice our gifts across the lifespan. Automation, of course, is progressively reducing job qualities. And what we need is not more jobs, but we have to provide now new sources of challenging activity. Health requires expanding our sacred practices to relieve tensions that are caused by our innate mutual strangeness. And so now we click for these products of sacred practice. With a click, you can get Spotify, Netflix, ESPN, Pornhub, and so on. But vicarious experience cannot substitute for participation. You know, we have to do these things for themselves. And so the fourth point is that health requires rebuilding our communities and finding new forms of communal life, because for our species, that is also a key source of our essential dopamine. So thank you very much, and I'm open for questions.
That's terrific. Thank you for giving such a far-reaching and incisive account of our evolutionary history and our current predicament. I think that many people here will have comments and reflections. So let me open it up to everybody here, please. Go ahead, and you can either raise your hand or put a comment in the chat, or unmute yourself. We probably won't have too many collisions. We're not such a large group. So,
how do you think AI will change these dynamics?
I did so on my link of my my email, I did a podcast with two people who were interested in AI. We discussed that. Well, I think to the extent that AI relieves us of having to do anything or think, it's not going to be good. But on the other hand, there's no reason why we can't. I don't think there's anything intrinsic about AI that prevents us from being creative. We can find new ways of being creative. No, I don't see any particular issue. Except for automation, you have to deal with it. We're automating rapidly, and we have to find other stuff for people to do.
But I mean, that really, the example of automation really clarifies it again. I think there's nothing intrinsic in automation that's problematic for people, but losing meaningful jobs is problematic. And if it's economically efficient for someone who's not thinking about the big picture, but is just concerned with a more proximate goal, that's what's driven this whole process. And similarly with AI, I mean, AI could be a platform for people to do much more intellectually challenging and engrossing things. But if it's used mainly to figure out how do we, optimize consumption, then we get more of the same.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we're in a very dangerous time, and the people have to take back our lives. And the people who are standing in the way are these gigantic corporations that have ruined agriculture, that have ruined industry, that have ruined cooperative work. And they're going to keep at it until we elect some people who can turn it around. And this is very urgent. I talked to some high school students yesterday, and I said, it's your time. Get out there and elect some decent people. And this is what we have to do.
You tell the story like in place of Richard Dawkins' selfish gene, we have the selfish dopamine circuit. kind of that, because that's the bottleneck, or that's the the thing that that valences everything, and that how that leaves us with a certain kind of vulnerability, which has been capitalized on in many ways. So how do we really work with that in some way?
Well, I think it's not the design of the dopamine circuit appeared 500 million years ago in this worm. The reason we still have it is because it was so brilliant. It's mathematically optimal. One of my neighbors, I live in the summertime in Amherst, Massachusetts. One of my neighbors is Andy Bartow, who's a guy who understood the underlying mathematics of this. And you can't design a more optimal system. And one of the points in my book is all our biochemistry, all our carbohydrate metabolism, our lipid metabolism, our brain functions are optimized from the nanometer scale up to the centimeter scale. So when you mess around with them, you're unlikely to improve these optimal systems. You're more likely to make them worse. I mean, if you live, imagine going on vacation where you maybe do a little work, you play with your children, you have a garden, you go out into nature, and you have activities that basically, and you play your guitar, you compose some music, you paint a painting. My wife is a painter, actually, when I was in my 20s, I was very attracted to Karl Marx, and he had this line saying, when we live under communism, finally, I will paint, I will hunt in the morning, I will fish in the afternoon, and I will write criticism in the evening. I have always found this very appealing, and sort of that's the way I'm able to live now. Although I probably still work harder than I should, but that is a human life. On the other hand, if I get my cataracts out, I want to get them out by a guy who does it, 30 of them a day in, day out. There's a role for expertise, but there's also a role, we've greatly exaggerated our lives into these, distorted them by these levels of expertise. We can find our way back into a reasonable way of life.
Other comments, or I have a few other things I can raise, but let's hear from some other people here. Things you'd like, clarifications, comments, questions.
I don't have the question formulated, but since there's no one raising it, I'm just going to try. Hi, Peter, this is Anna. I contacted you as part of setting this talk up. I was wondering how you speak of the distress. You speak more social distress and how it links to mental health, but I wonder if you've had any thoughts on sort of how affective regulation plays into some of what you've described, and how or emotional regulation, whatever you want to call it. And if you could speak to that a little bit and expand on your thoughts on that. Is there anything that you would say along the lines of affective allostasis, as like putting it out there? I'm just wondering if you've had any thoughts on that.
Sure. I'll answer your question, then I'll make another point. We have these very complicated brains, and so and that makes us vulnerable, as I showed in those two monk slide and the the Cain and Abel slide, and really the Old Testament, the Judeo-Christian Old Testament describes story after story after story of human frailty, problems that people get into, and the ways that they get out. And when I read that, I was raised in a leftist household, all talking about social levels, and with that very little discussion of individual responsibility, individual morality, and so on. And I was in my 40s before I realized, I'm in trouble. And I began to read the Old Testament, and every story in Genesis had me in tears because this described my own experience. For example, my experience of going to the Freedom Rides, people said, well, weren't you scared? I said, well, no, my father raised me to do that. And so we were like Abraham and Isaac, Abraham laying his son down to be sacrificed possibly. And when I read that, I was very moved, and I still am sometimes. I asked my father, did you understand that we were acting out this ancient story? He said, yes, he did. And he was very scared. So I went through a period of realizing, how my family worked, all the scheming and all the various complicated aspects. And I began return to sort of my Jewish roots to understand some of this stuff. So I think, this is a long answer to your question, but it was a complicated question. I think we have evolved along with our big brains. We evolved these various social practices, which include social instruction. Children learn how to behave to each other and how to behave to older people, how to behave in their environment. And I think the current large-scale social disruption has made those things difficult to teach. And so I think we need to return to some I hate to use the word family values, but I think in this case, I think I mean something serious. I think the other thing is that I think our educational system is really abominable, because it takes, in the US, 35 kids of all different abilities, all different interests and native talents, and crams them into a room and tells them to sit still and listen to the teacher for 45 minutes. Many of them can't do it because they're not designed to do it. They're out on some curve, and they're looking for something else. We shouldn't be forcing everybody to do the same thing. We should take these kids into school, try to do some inquiry. What are their innate talents, and provide them opportunities to focus on those talents. Teach them a little, some basic skills. Everybody has to be able to read and add and subtract, but most of the rest of it isn't necessary beyond what the children express. So I think we can grow much healthier children with a healthier educational system, which was really designed to put people into an industrial system, which we really don't need anymore. So that would be a key thing, fix education. Let me just, before I yield the floor, I do have another slide. I don't think it's necessary, but people, when I show that deaths of despair rising like this, often people say, well, what does Europe know? Why are they so much better off? And I have a slide that lists all the things that Europe, and to some extent, a large extent, Canada do, which is prenatal care, postnatal care. Parents have time off. They have free preschool. They have free medical care. They have pensions. They have, in the US, there is no law that says you have to have a paid vacation. So in the US, 25% of workers don't have any time off. So you can go through the whole list of social supports that Europe does, and to some extent Canada does, and that the US doesn't do. And it would be very easy for us to do it. We just have to, it's just a couple of senators and representatives that are standing in the way,
Well, other questions or comments?
I'm wondering, you guys see a lot of people. How are you doing with the the prescription of drugs, antipsychotics, antidepressants, and stuff like that? I see that as a real problem. I just don't see how people can function with 3 or 4 of those drugs. I mean, it's like the hypertension. What is your experience with?
We all have our own. So a few of us are, not everybody here is practitioners. There are a lot of people who are social scientists or working in other areas, but there are several psychiatrists here and some psychologists. So I mean, I think, first of all, most of us try not to have several drugs. Most of us try to find one thing that might be helpful to some extent. But I'll pose this back to you. One of my concerns as a psychiatrist has been that we intervene with drugs and systems that are homeostatic or allostatic. So we're not really fixing something that's broken. We're shifting a set point or something in a regulatory system that pushes back against that. And there's old studies at McGill showing that antipsychotics, for example, cause a kind of denervation supersensitivity in dopaminergic systems. So you can actually end up with worse psychotic symptoms after you're taken off this medication. And that, to me, has been a big anxiety, apprehension, concern about what's going on with psychiatric medications. Antidepressants would be another likely candidate for such things occurring. And we don't really study that very much. And it's kind of buried in the big social changes where, medications are embraced and so on. And that's something I've also witnessed over the course of my career. When I was an undergraduate in psychology in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of concern about medications. I remember an article in Science by, I think, Judith Rabkin talking about the problems of medication and so on. But we live through a cultural change in which suddenly medications are much more acceptable as a kind of fix or palliation or whatever. And so I do have serious concerns. I'm posing this to you partly as a social critic and trying to using an evolutionary biological perspective to think about human adaptation, but also as a neuroscientist and who understands a lot about these circuits and who introduced the idea of allostasis, whether you share that concern, what you think, and why it's hard to get people to take that seriously, why there's such pushback that we really are fixing things. Psychiatry still hopes that we're going to have these pharmacological solutions for things that, even if they are neurobiological, they're biological at the level of circuits, not at the level of synapses for the most part. So anyway, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that basically there's no rationale for giving any of these drugs. I mean, our depression, the claim was we're depressed because our serotonin is low or our dopamine is low. This isn't true. There's no evidence for that. And so most of the drugs that are given are not because there's mental disorders. Well, I think that the genome-wide studies that are coming out now, which I try to follow, what they're showing is that the circuits that drive our cognition and our emotion, really, there's a tremendous variability, as I've said, and there's some people that are out on the tail. Just the way there are tall people, there's 7-foot tall people, but they're not disordered. They just got the genes for tall. And so we have these heterogeneous circuits. And if you're out on the 1% of a circuit that's associated with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, you're going to suffer and people around you will suffer. But that is not evidence that there's a dysfunction and a disorder. And I think that people who are selling that basically, are just wrong. And usually there's, it's big. One of my scientist friends talked about the industry. And I think the academic parts, many of neuroscience is just feeding into the big pharma and the government funding agencies to sell drugs for which there is no rationale. For example, I studied this paper that came out yesterday in, I think, Nature Medicine, big high status thing, talking about psilocybin. That's a new thing. Michael Pollan has given us psilocybin. There's not a reason in the world to think that psilocybin is going to improve people's depression. You might find somebody who says, yes, it helped me. But of course, when you find somebody who says, yes, it helped me, that is just a case account. It doesn't compare to double-blind studies. And so now they're saying, this paper said psilocybin is disconnecting it's connecting unitary areas of the brain across things, and that's what's causing it. This is all basically, if you pardon me, bullshit. These people are making this up. And how how they got this thing published in Science, I don't know, but people are, Nature, people are ready to hear this, to think that the problems we face can be solved with a drug. Same thing, we're going to solve obesity. I follow the metabolic literature. Oh, here's a new biochemical pathway that affects appetite. Well, okay, this is a new druggable target to cure obesity. People are eating themselves to death because they're trying to fill the hole in their heart, and they try to do it by filling their stomach. This is not going to be cured by drugs. And so I think the whole medical industry now is just veering on the edge of some sort of insanity, really, and they need to be turned around. I'm very eager to give my talk and get my book to pre-medical students so they can read it before they go to medical school, because then they'll ask better questions and challenge some of this. Same thing with insulin. When you have so much carbohydrate circulating that you have so much insulin circulating, your insulin receptors turn down their sensitivity. What is medical doctors call that? Insulin resistance. There's something bad about insulin. It's resisting. The body is resisting it. This is nonsense. It's insulin receptors that are adapting to its high levels, just the way the eye adapts to bright light. So, no, I think the problem of drugs is, and the idea that we can solve our existential problems with medicine is just completely wrong. Yeah, so thank you for that. Bruce Alexander, I think, is the same guy who published these papers in the late 70s called Rat Park. His idea is if you raise rats in a large colony, which is their normal way of doing, they have stuff to play with and they can mate at will and they play games and so on, that they are less likely to drink a morphine solution than rats that are raised in an isolated cage. And he published several papers on this, and they're really, amazing. And so he started off the idea that animal interest in dopamine-evoking drugs is correlated with their own despair, their own isolation, and so on. So I spent a lot of this week actually looking to see what had happened to his papers since 1980. And it turns out, there were some technical difficulties. Now people do experiments differently. So I just finished this morning a review of all of the experiments since his work on the social integration that protects us from addiction. And he might have gotten a few things that didn't last, but basically he got it right. And I think there's a lot of agreement now in the field that our rich social life is basically a decent protection against an interest in intoxicating drugs. Yeah, as I go, I've been giving talks on college campuses. I was at Notre Dame last week and University of Virginia, and I've been at Stanford and Berkeley and so on. If you walk around a college campus where both the young people and the faculty are deeply engaged in activities that interest them, and they are doing their equivalent of hunter-gatherer, then they're all pretty much looking trim and fit and sober, and that isn't to say everybody is perfect, but basically, if you're engaged in these ways that Alexander talks about, you're much less likely to be facing any of these health issues, from hypertension to addiction. Yeah, I think he's done a lot of good.
He has a book called The Globalization of Addiction, a study in the poverty of spirit, which sort of takes that, the kind of experimental work you're talking about and sort of projects it onto the large the large canvas that you've been talking about. And I guess in the phrase poverty of spirit, he's alluding to some of the very same things you've been talking about in terms of meaningful engagement with things that really require us to use all our faculties. And,
yeah.
Other comments? I'm curious, a lot of us here are quite interested right now in the modeling work in computational neuroscience and psychiatry that's going on, influenced by the work of Carl Friston, that's using sort of this Bayesian brain idea of, predicting the world. And we've been particularly directly involved with trying to extend that to talking about the social world and the idea that, human cognition is not just a thing that individual brains do. As you said, it's something we do cooperatively, and that maybe we can have a way of incorporating that into our ideas of everyday function, brain function, and so on. So I'm curious as to the extent that you've looked at that literature, which comes at this from a very different and maybe very general and might say overly general, overly abstract level. But what your thoughts are about that?
I've tried to read Carl Friston's papers in this area, and I have an interest in theoretical neuroscience, and I worked with a physicist for my last 10 years on optimality and stuff like that. But to be honest, I cannot understand what he's talking about. And I've asked my physics friend, and so it's on our project is to sit down with some Friston papers and really work through them. But I think he publishes about 200 papers a year, and and so if he'd publish one that I could understand, But I would say in general, I'm interested. I think the brain is governed by these principles that use energy and space efficiently. For example, one of my two papers were about the diameter of axons in the optic nerve and very large ones, large diameter, and many smaller diameter. And of course, the space involved taken by an axon goes up as the square of its diameter. And so one large axon can accommodate a gazillion small ones. The shape of this curve is the same for the optic nerve as for the pyramidal tract, as for the fornix, the output of the hippocampus. And so the brain is seriously designed to send some information very slowly by small axons and a few things fast by large axons. And of course, the energy use also goes as the square of the diameter. So I do care about these things, but I cannot understand. First of all, I think they're interesting. I don't think that they have much to do with the problems that are facing us now, And so I've sort of set those aside to shift gears and focus on these higher level issues, which I think are critical.
Yeah. Well, I should mention there's a new book just out from MIT Press on active inference and so on, written by some of his colleagues. He acknowledges in the preface that he's not the one who did it because he couldn't write as clear an exposition. So that's an entree into the modeling approach. I'll send you a paper we have in behavioral and brain sciences called Thinking Through Other Minds. That tries to take this idea and say, fine, but human beings again are, the last 50,000 years plus have been social coevolution. So much of our cognition is really cooperative with other people. So can we use the same approaches though, which, have some elegance to them in terms of modeling and showing certain kinds of optimization? Can we use that to begin to talk about social processes? And that's where it might eventually make a bridge to say, so why do we get bad ideas that spread and that everybody subscribes to, and our normativity doesn't always serve our best interests and so on.
Sure. So I would say the person who I've found very, very interesting to read and very understandable is Joe Henrich. He's an anthropologist at Harvard and very clear. I'm forgetting the most recent book, but each one of them is full of really good stuff, and he does experiments. I mean, he tries to figure out how, he uses game theory actually to investigate different cultures and so on. So that's something. But I will look at this new book too.
Well, I think, and I share your enthusiasm for Joe Henrich. And again, what's interesting about that work and what's different from the general modeling is his work is very historical in the end. It's very much about particular histories, particular paths that, communities or populations have followed. And some of that might be for, accidental or incidental reasons at a certain point, but it then begins to unfold, just like phylogeny, it begins to unfold. Things have to build on where they were. And I think this, again, is part of our collective history. We sometimes paint ourselves into corners. And you could argue that we're in the midst of doing that right now with the global economic system.
Well, so I do argue in my book this issue of are things really optimal? Did we get painted into a corner evolutionarily? And I think it's wrong. And I do. The first chapter is devoted to saying the idea of optimality is not a Panglossian idea. This is chemistry and physics, and so I do go into that. I don't think we're trapped in a. There's no way out now. I just think there's a very clear way out. We have to take back control over consumption and levels of ways of living from the people who are really profiting outrageously from it. And it doesn't require to get back to where other countries are. US doesn't require a Marxist revolution. It just requires taking some of the social product and sharing it with the people who are really right now suffering. And this is a no-brainer. We are not trapped, but we do have to get young people out there to vote and to get votes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to put it that way, because until very recently, I think here in Canada that we were a little bit smug that we had a different sort of, what we say, different sense of identity, different way of framing issues. So it was like with many countries in Europe, it was incomprehensible that the US did not have universal medical care. Like, why would any society that had resources not make this among their top priorities for why we formed societies in the first place? So that was very hard to understand, but we do have a nascent right-wing movement in Canada now that is being fed by some of the same, combination of, well, again, it's very important to understand what are those things, what are the appetites, what are the framings of issues, and what are the social processes that amplify what look to be very bad ideas and very self-destructive ideas, but that seem to really get a grip on people. And this is a global. It's not just the U.S., although the U.S. has had its own fairly catastrophic recent, still ongoing dilemmas with that. But this is happening everywhere. It's happening throughout Europe, Southeast Asia, and so on. So
I think, in the US, you can see very clearly who those people are, and those are the people who are suffering most. So you have to get to them, find out what their pain is, and you have to fix their sources of pain, and that will relieve everything. So there's a gentleman,
Francis.
Dr. Lou.
Yes, Dr. Lou.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that stimulating talk. And I had two questions. The first one follows up exactly on what Lawrence brought up, and that is this right-wing movement that is flooding the world right now, and how does that? It's so counter to your sense of coherence and community and that we really need. And this whole issue in America of providing for the safety net is a no-brainer, but America just is behind the curve on all of that. And so is there a way of trying to understand this right-wing movement as in terms of some connection to the brain mechanisms that you've discussed? Is it an aberration of allostasis, or is it allostasis in another aberrant way?
Well,
that's the first question.
Yeah. Okay. So let me do one at a time. Yes, I think it's a very good question, and I think it's a very helpful way to put it. I guess what I would look. I'm a retinal scientist. This is my opinion. I'm not an authority here, but my understanding is that dopamine. One of the sources of dopamine is human unification and cooperation. We sing together. We go to church together. We hold hands together. And that's very important. Well, the right-wing people in the US now are doing those things together. It's just that they have machine guns. I mean, and their way of getting together is to be angry at somebody else. So no, I think they wouldn't be doing it. If you're not getting dopamine from it, you're not going to be doing it. Okay. So they're getting fed, but it's in a very counterproductive way. They're avoiding the very things they need, like jobs and education and so on. So how to figure out how to overcome that is a huge challenge. And my guess would be, intuitively, you guys are the mental health people, but you have to find some way to invite people. You have to offer them something that they need. And if the old people can't get it, offer it to the children. I mean, so you're not going to get it by beating them up. You're going to get it somehow by feeding, taking care of some of their pain. Yeah,
that's very helpful. And I think a book that I'm sure many in the room would know about is Jonathan Metzl's book that came out about 3 years ago called Dying of Whiteness, that analyzes the Trump supporters and the paradoxical support of Trump when in fact the Republican policies go counter to their actual needs. But I think you've perhaps explained it, that they're getting dopamine somehow by this resentment politics and projection of badness, projection of evil out there, and all of this is really supplying dopamine and the communal spirit of saving America and all of this.
Right. Exactly. What's your other question?
The other question was the cave art. I found that very intriguing. And of course, it made me think of the Werner Herzog film that came out about 4 or 5 years ago, The Cave of Forgotten Dreams.
Right.
And that whole question of why these people were doing this cave art and what purpose does it serve? Right. And I'm just, one thing that I'm kind of working on is that cave art a source of wonder and awe that somehow leads to a sense of connectedness to the larger universe?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a wonderful thing that we can all speculate about. So I noticed that, the caves of Lascaux and Altamira, those are famous, the French and the Spanish caves. Those are magnificent, but those were like 20,000 years ago. Some of these are way older. And I mean, the one I showed from Indonesia is 44,000 years. I mean, we were just barely wet behind the ears. The cave hands on the cover of my book are cave from a cave painting, and yeah, that's it. I love that image. And the hands are the same, by the way, wherever you go. And they're done by finding a pigment, ochre, typically, grinding it up and using hollow bones to blow stencils. That's the way they do it. They did it in Indonesia, they did it in France, they do it in South America. And the cave paintings, that cave painting is from it's called La Cueva de las Manos in Argentina, the Cave of the Hands. And it's dated to about 10 to 12,000 years ago. That is when the first people arrived in those caves in Argentina. And so I think it was just that this is the first thing that our species does. You get to a place that's got a cave and somebody says, I'll get the food, I'll get the dinner, you go start that painting, and I don't know why, but it's such an immediate response. When I was choosing the figures for the book, I was trying to think of, graffiti in tunnels, all over Europe, all over the US. You go into a tunnel and there are these paintings, and they're very, very skilled. It isn't just desecration or anything. These are some kids, young people with an artistic bent, 1% of the population. they invest in big cans of expensive paint, and they go in and they do these phenomenal things. I looked around for a figure to use. I couldn't find something, right? But I think what they're doing with this tunnel graffiti is they're reenacting our very primal gifts. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one. We have a question from Elizabeth Perelman, but let me just ask one thing that follows up on the earlier question from Francis before we go to Elizabeth. In talking about the idea that Trump supporters or Viktor Orban supporters or whoever supporters have, get this pleasant and reinforcing experience in a very analogous way that anybody else does for any other thing, whether it's having a donut or hugging a friend. It seems to leave out the idea that there are other things going on that are part of the mix. And so specifically in this case, it seems to me that there's other circuitry, if you will, that's related to detecting danger and threat of a certain kind, and that is often more salient or overrides things that are comfortable or pleasant. And because we have this problem of we have these media now, and we have this possibility, everybody has a megaphone if they have access to the internet. And so we have this kind of amplification and reproduction of anxiety-provoking, fear-provoking, threat messages. So it's not just antagonism toward the other, it's a way of, and in the politics of it and the rhetoric of it, it's very much framing the other as a danger, as a threat. This is going to be child abuse. This is going to be Pizzagate. This is, so, and that really grabs attention. If you have a pleasant message, a positive message, it might be a very good experience you're promoting, but it will not be as salient, at least in the initial attempt to grab somebody's attention, as somebody else who's yelling fire, and so just to say this only one example, I think we could talk about several other examples where there seemed to be an intersection of several kinds of, we call them biobehavioral systems or adaptive systems or something.
Absolutely. I mean, when you are in a rage, it's not just dopamine, it's norepinephrine and adrenaline. It's not the only chemical in the brain. And, I've certainly, imagine I'm not alone, experienced moments of rage that carry some satisfaction. You just feel alive, and you're ready to go. So I understand that feeling. There's a reason why our ancestors portrayed a lot of the world as a battle between good and evil, light and darkness.
So let me just add two additional things to that, and we'll go to Elizabeth. So one is that, again, from a Canadian perspective, when we look at the US, it's a culture that valorizes anger in a particular way. And this is very much Trump's rhetoric, that he comes across as a righteous, angry guy, even if it's often foolish bluster. And I think that privileges that it gives a kind of what can we say, a kind of legitimacy and a kind of confidence in that form of self-presentation. So I think that's an element of this whole thing that to me is important. And the other thing is that I'm reading this book by Jonathan Harry called Stolen Focus, and where he's talking about what happened in the design of the internet and the economics of that, where basically the idea is people are monetizing public attention. So the idea is, can we grab as much attention as possible? And they've deliberately taken the idea that, well, what's going to grab attention much more is fearful, disturbing things. People will spend much more time looking at those because it's adaptive in the long run. Figuring out what the danger is and what to do about it is really going to grab your attention. And that's not just a bias, let's say, in human attention systems. It's something that's being very deliberately exploited in a way, in what your feedback is on your social media accounts or whatever. So I'm just saying that these dynamics in this case, which is we've got brain dynamics, we have adaptive dynamics, and we have very deliberate economic strategy and marketing strategy that is skillfully capitalizing on that. So I see that as part of the particular toxic moment, let's say, that we're at.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'm not sure I have a feeling that it was always thus. I mean, if you go back in the 19th century, you'll find these things, so yeah, but I don't necessarily think that fear mongering trumps, if you'll pardon the expression, trumps touching moments. I mean, there's many things on the internet, there's kittens and, cats taking care of ducks and, all this stuff,
Yeah.
that people do watch. And I would say, so my publisher said, I said, are you going to get me on NPR? No. Are you going to get me? No. My editor, who I like a lot, said, get on Twitter. So when the book came out, I got on Twitter and I spent, an inordinate amount of time on it because it does give these little stupid pulses. So I put out a lot of my social commentary as tweets. I find the format actually quite fun. You can say something succinctly and see what people say to it. And I would say I've been doing this for 2 years, and I'm getting better at it, but I have had very little pushback. I mean, of course, it feeds me the people who agree with me and so on. But over the time, I think it's been sustaining. My effort has been sustaining to the people who do follow me and see what's Sterling going to say today to encourage us, basically. And and one of the things that it allowed me to do was that I live in Panama now. This is where I'm talking to you from Panama. And so I tweeted in Spanish about the book. And I occasionally tweet, I tweet the birds from Panama and I tweet, various things. And so I have a following in Argentina and Chile and Mexico and so on. So I am about to bring out the book in a Spanish translation. I got the MIT gave me the rights and.
Nice. Oops.
In Argentina, 2 physicians who helped clean up the translation, and they got to publicize it and so on. So I think the internet can work in our favor. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I have to say, tweeting birds seems like totally opposite. It's like finally Twitter found its true calling. Exactly. But anyway, so Elizabeth, please, do you want to read us or tell us your comment and question?
Yes, thank you. And I'm based in the US in Arizona, so I apologize in some way. But actually, this is a good segue because I'm thinking about time and how we spend our time. And I'm just wondering how we can advocate for policies to take what you're saying into account and really promote art and music and things that we value, but people may not have time for if you're working 2 shifts, if there's no childcare. You mentioned salt and thinking about diet. I'm just curious if you or others have examples of how we can, how does this move forward for the, I'm not a neuroscientist, so how does it move forward for the people who are thinking about putting these into practice and working with people in communities who do value, sacred practices, but may not have the resources, may not have the time, may not have the ability to practice these. So thank you.
Well, I don't have anything special. I take my time that I don't need to brush my teeth and wash my clothes, cook my dinner, and I spend it on these sorts of things. Right now, I am actually involved in we're building a park. One of my friends bought a lot of land along the river south of town, and it's 20 acres, and his dream was to make Central Park, a fancy, real back to nature. And I happen to have learned a lot about the trees here, and so he asked me to choose the trees for his park, and so that's what I'm doing. And then he says, "Well, how are we going to afford to do it?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to pay for that." I mean, I don't need very much money now. I have enough money to do that. And a lot of things, public things that need to be done, people say, "Well, who's going to pay for that?" Well, a lot of us have money that we could well afford to spend on that. So that's what I do. My wife works in hospice. She, for a while, worked in a group called Buenos Vecinos, who are taking food to poor people. So, you know, there's so many, you know, there's an infinity of possible community activities. Somebody just has to get them started, and then, you know, and then you gotta hustle them. I just made friends with a guy my age who's got some money and is interested in this park. You know, I've invited him to help. You know, so there's no end to it. You know, and you just need a couple of people to join together and get started. You know?
Yeah, and these are not necessarily insights that we need to get from neuroscience. I mean, there's other good reasons for saying this is how to live a good life, kind of. But it's nice when we have other arguments for people who say, oh, but that's not well grounded in human nature or something like that.
Yeah, so that, you know, that's what I feel is my job right now. Is I know this stuff, you know, and I know as much about it as anybody, and I have spent the time trying to get down to what human nature looks like, really, you know, and the book has been read by a bunch of anthropologists and so on. So I feel like I should be saying this to people. It's not your brain. It's not some little molecule you're missing. No, we got to take our lives back, you know.
Yeah, this is so relevant to, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of our immediate concerns here is having gotten involved with this very large neuroscience research program at McGill, which is centered on neuroinformatics and big data, but which includes all kinds of other lines of work. And that as one of its products hopes to generate something called the Canadian Framework for Brain Health, which is going to have all kinds of recommendations for policy and so on. And I ended up chairing this process, which is a bit ironic, although I have some undergraduate training in neuroscience and what at the time was called physiological psychology with Ron Melzak and Donald Hebb and other people. But my orientation now is very much, you know, about human beings as social beings and how we optimize that level of our existence. So, so it's an interesting challenge then to say, okay, so if we put that in dialogue with the best available neuroscience, what would neuroscience look like, and what would our policy look like?
Sure. Well, that's great. I just published a paper in JAMA Psychiatry. I don't know if you saw it. With Michael Platt, who was a physiological psychologist, primatologist, you know, dopamine guy, and basically it takes up this death of despair and it lays out, and I show this curve of the human life cycle, and it points out that, you know, we've lost the grandparents, we've lost the parents, we're down to one parent taking care of a child. 25% of children in the US are growing up with one parent. It's not feasible. You can't do it. Even if you can give them calories, you really can't take care of them in a proper way. So I would say, if you don't have that, I will send you, in fact, I'd be grateful if you'd share my email links with your community, and I will send you the JAMA piece if you don't have it. I think that would be helpful, actually.
That would be great. I have the JAMA piece, but I won't put it in the chat right now. But please do send it to us, and we'll make sure it gets to everyone. And again, if we end up putting this talk up, with your permission, then we would also put it up with links to the appropriate resources, so people who want to follow up on it have a quick way to get to that stuff. So, and I think, you know, we may well take you up on your offer to go through your book a bit more systematically, because there's so much in there that, as I say, because part of our challenge now is to really to say something that's meaningful to two audiences, to an audience of neuroscientists who are often focused in a much more, what can we say, circumscribed way in trying to unpack very particular mechanisms and understand how they work, which is, you know, important, exciting work. And then policy people who are saying, but what can we do now? What's the wisest thing to do now with what we have available? And also, as new findings come out, how do we how do we digest those in a sensible way? Because as you know, again, the way the game works is things tend to get oversold at a certain point, because that's how you get the next grant, and that's how everybody tells you you're doing a good job. So we need something in between, a filter in between, or a translation process in between that is conducive to a certain kind of wisdom about things. So.
Right, I agree. That's absolutely what we need. So anything I can do to help, I will do. I think that article is a start, but this is what I do now.
Super. Stephanie's had her hand up. Sorry, Stephanie, for a while. Do you want to?
Yeah. Oh, hi. Thank you so much for this talk. I was been reflecting upon what you brought up, that we have with our lovely large brains mental distress that comes with it, and interpersonal conflict, and to benefit from each other, we need to cohere. And I'm just struck that because we have a lot of siloed conversations these days with how fast information travels, and with the internet, we've lost a lot of shared symbols and shared practices. And I struggle to imagine a way for us to cohere with the heterogeneity that we have. I can make room for people who have traditions that don't mean something to me. I love that, but it does take me significant cognitive input to understand, because it's not something that is a simple tradition that is from my background. And I think that we've lost monoculture, which I'm glad for all the conversations that is brought up, but we're not watching the same thing at the same time. We're not reading the same thing at the same time, because we can access it all at different points. So I'm wondering what you might have to say about coming together with symbols and traditions that might not really mean the same thing to all of us.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. I thought about that, and people say, so Passover is coming up. It's tomorrow, and so what people say at the end of Passover, it's a celebration around here. I explain to what was Passover. I say it's the La Ultima Cena, it's the Last Supper. And oh, they get that. In the Christian tradition. So the thing is, these are all different cultures, and each one of us is attached to one or the other. But the fact is, I think the most amazing stuff from the human genome that's coming out now is all of these sequencing of regional genomes across the planet. And so now they can trace, when we left Africa at 50,000 years ago, only maybe 50,000 years into our specieshood, we got to Indonesia in no time. From Indonesia, we used stone axes to carve, wooden boats to get to Australia and New Guinea. I mean, then we went up over the Siberian land bridge. And what the genome studies are showing now is it wasn't just one group that came across that land bridge. There was wave after wave after wave coming down to Panama, crossing the isthmus here into South America. There was a dozen of these groups, and they all mixed. They all integrate, with each other. And so now we find, if you ask anybody who's done their 23andMe, they say, yeah, I'm 3% Ashkenazi Jew, I'm 2% Neanderthal, I'm so on. So the point is, at the end of Passover, people say next year in Jerusalem, next year in Israel. So this was an important thing for this group. But I think about this now. What genetic science shows is that home was always someplace else. Everybody came from someplace else. And this is true since our species left Africa. So I think we should sort of not forget, but we can do without, we can celebrate each other's holidays, and I think we have over the millennia have merged these traditions in various rich ways.
Thank
You're
you.
you're describing what some people would call a cosmopolitan view, which which I personally subscribe to very much, and I think again there are historical and cultural reasons for that being a sensible way of thinking of humanity. But some of my work is with indigenous peoples who are very rooted to a particular place, who understand that's what it is to be human in a way. Again, I mean, I think it's important for our collective diversity, but it also poses challenges because then there are struggles over whose place is this and how do we incorporate the other. And again, putting in the largest possible frame because of climate change and so on, we know we're on the cusp of the largest migrations, forced migrations, probably in human history, and we're ill-equipped right now to respond morally to those. So
right, yeah, no, it's very challenging, but we have to be clear that human beings moved through each other's cultures, interbred, and we have to reject the idea that purity is something meaningful. And I think even with the indigenous people here and in Canada. I mean, we live in a community of indigenous people here, and the family who lives on our farm still speak their language, but their children do, but their children's children won't. And we are helping the children on the farm move from the life they were born on the Camarca, the reserve. They came down. The families come down to do the harvest, the coffee harvest, and so we've been here 18 years, and so the kids that were born on our farm are now ready for university. And we are helping them do that because they're not going to make a living the way their father did, and their mother did. So they have to study, they have to learn English. They've been pretty slow to do it, but now they're realizing this is important. And the whole community has changed immensely in the 20 years that we've been here. So yeah, those are real challenges, and that's happening all over the world, definitely. But I don't think that neuroscience has much to offer that, except to say, the very general things that I've tried to say. This is sort of, I think the most important thing that I am saying now is that our brain came from a worm, and we're using the same circuit, and you're not going to fix it by something that doesn't need fixing. Our brains are not broken, really, and that's what I'm saying about addiction. Our brains are just not broken. They just need better care. I mean, our minds need better care. That's it.
I think that's a very helpful apothem to end on. I just want to thank you for a tremendously stimulating and thought-provoking and in some ways profound discussion. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time. And as I say, we're probably going to take you up on, ask for a bit more of your time and hopefully continue this conversation.
It's a pleasure to talk to people who are interested as you are, and and are thinking about we're all on on a similar page, and we need to support each other. So thank you. I received support from this as well, and so I'm anxious to share it. And thank you. Sorry for my confusion.
Not at all. It's worked out fine, and I think, as Elizabeth made this comment, appreciating the optimism, and I do have to say that's one of the things that is very encouraging about your own, the way you're living your life, have lived your life, the way in what you're expressing now is an optimism at a moment when one only has to read the headlines in the New York Times to feel kind of pessimistic. So it's very helpful. Yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you again for the presentation. I hope to see you all again before too long.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.